We just got finished beating, and now we're starting that long period. Did you guys notice between the T wave and the next P wave, there was a long time where nothing happens? The heart is totally relaxed. And I told you, the heart spends most of its time relaxed. That way we don't wear it out, and in 10 years we get to live to a ripe old age. So what's going to happen is when this guy is relaxed, the AV valve is going to be open between the two atria and the two ventricles. So that means that blood coming in from the vena cava is going to go straight through the atria and fall straight into the ventricle. No effort required. Same thing on the left side. So the blood comes in and it just goes straight through there, and that's it. About 80% of the blood that's going to fill up the ventricle is just going to fall straight in. But, and this is why atrial fibrillation is not such a big deal, because 80% of the blood is going to fall in whether the atrium is contract or not. But the last 20%, the atria squeeze it in there. Okay? Atrial kick or whatever. Anyway, these guys depolarize, and this guy's already about 8/10 of the way filled, and he's going to squeeze the last 20% in there. Okay? Makes sense so far, right? Everything is copacetic. Okay. This guy's going to have to relax, right? Because we've got our buddy, the AV node, who's going to hold things up until this guy gets ready to be in a relaxed state, which is part of our PQ PR interval. Okay, with me so far, guys? Now, the signal finally gets through the ventricle and he starts to contract from the bottom up, right? Just like we talked about in toothpaste. He starts to contract. First thing we're going to get is he's going to start squeezing, and as he squeezes, he's going to put pressure on the blood in the ventricle. Makes sense, right? Eventually, remember that these guys open up like this. Eventually, the pressure here is going to be so much higher here that those guys are going to snap shut. And the word snap is very appropriate. That's S1, the first heart sound, the love of the love dove. That is the sound of the two AV valves slamming shut. They close because the pressure in here gets higher than the pressure here. Okay, so I guess now the semilunar valves just automatically open and everything goes. Nope. The pressure in here is higher than the atrium, but it's still lower than the pressure outside these valves, which means the pressure inside the pulmonary trunk and the pressure in the aorta. Blood pressure normally is like 120 over 80, right? That means that the valve, the aortic valve opening into the aorta is not going to open until that ventricle is higher than 80. Does that make sense, guys? If you have two people pushing on a door, which is basically what these valves are, the guy who's pushing the strongest is going to move it, right? So as long as the pressure in the aorta is 80, as long as the pressure in the ventricle is less, that valve is not going to move. But as soon as he gets up to 80, he's going to push it open, and then the blood's going out. The same thing happens in the pulmonary valve, only the pressures aren't nearly as high, but still it takes a little bit of going. Okay. So for just a brief moment, all the valves are closed, right? And the ventricles are squeezing, they're contracting. Okay, we'll throw a big word at you and scare you. So I'll get back when you let me in this crowd. Here's my scary word. Isovolumetric contraction. Oh no! Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. This is it. And all it means, isovolumetric means the volume doesn't change, it's the same. In other words, the blood doesn't leave the heart. The heart's squeezing, but it's not going anywhere. Why? Because he hasn't got enough pressure yet to push the door open. Remember, the pulmonary and the aortic valve are the doors that leave the heart. You go in one door, you got an indoor, you got an outdoor. You do not normally use the same one, right? So the indoor is closed because it doesn't take the ventricles longer to get more pressure than the atrium because they're kind of puny. But the other valves open up into big blood vessels that require a lot more pressure. So the guy is squeezing, but he's not actually moving any blood. He's got the same volume, and that's what isovolumetric means. Okay? That's all it is. How do you know if that's what's happening? He's contracting, and all the valves are closed. All the valves are closed. Please remember that term. That's going to be really important for you. But eventually, this guy, as we said, he's going to eventually push open those guys because he's going to have more pressure. And if you guys remember from again from the blood pressure, at the peak, the left ventricle is going to come up with 120 millimeters of mercury. That's the top number, the systolic. When he does that, he's going to push it open. Now, we know he squeezed the blood out. He's got his blood out. Now it's time for him to relax. He's going to relax. And again, he's pushed the door open because he has more pressure. But eventually, as he relaxes, the door is going to be pushed closed again. The valves are going to be snapped shut. That is S2, the second heart sound, the dub, love dub, love dub. AV valves closing, which is the beginning of the contraction of the ventricle. The dub, the semilunar valves, in other words, the pulmonary or aortic valves, are closing. Contraction is over. You guys will hear this because when we're going to do all of this in the lab, I promise you. Third and fourth heart sound have to do with, you don't normally hear those in adults. You can hear those in peds patients. That's the sound of atrial filling, and I can't remember what that is. It's innocuous, innocent heart murmurs. That's what they call them, is innocent heart murmurs. They're actually not. They're actually just normal heart sounds, but you just normally can't hear them in an adult. We'll hear the love dub. If you hear an S3 and an S4 in an adult, that'd be normal. How would you know? It'll be between the love and the dub. How do you know which one is the love and the dub? I said the love is when the heart is contracting. Is that when your pulse is going to be shooting out? Put your hand on the radial pulse while you're listening with a stethoscope. Whichever sound is happening at the same time as the pulse, that's the love. In other words, that's S1. Okay. So we talked about the heart sounds. You know what they are. It makes sense that the heart sound, since that's the closing of the AV valve, it makes sense that it happens at the beginning of ventricular contraction, right? Because that's what squeezes those things shut, right? It was when this guy started squeezing, he's the one who slammed these guys shut. So it makes sense that this guy is going to be at the same time that the ventricle is really starting to contract. It also kind of makes sense that this guy, the S2 sound, is going to be during ventricular repolarization during the T wave. Because when are the semilunar valves going to be closed? When the ventricle is relaxing and stops pushing so hard on the valve, right? Did I lose anybody on this one? Yeah, I'm not saying you're gonna get this all in a one earful, guys, but yes, sir.
The S2 is which is the sound of which valve, please?
Aortic and pulmonary.
Which are
And
the
that
semilunar
happens
valve.
when the ventricles are relaxing. They've already squeezed the blood out, now they're relaxing, getting ready to be filled up again. So eventually, the blood in the aorta is going to be of a higher pressure than the ventricle because the ventricle's contracting. And when that happens, he's going to take the aortic valve and push it closed. And that snap in here is the heart sound that we use our stethoscope to auscultate. So we're good on the heart sounds, we're good on the EKG. Am I right? Am I exaggerating? I'm lying, I'm dying? No, I'm not. I'll die someday, but it doesn't have to be just right this time. Look right there, guys, and you see the isovolumetric contraction. It's going to start when you hear the first heart sound. It's going to end sometimes around the S wave before you get to the ST segment. It just means that even though the heart is contracting electrically, the conduction system, it still hasn't built up enough force to push the door open. Okay. And there's the same thing, the AV valves closing, there's the aortic valve opening. Let me wait till I get to there. I need to start talking about pressures. We kind of already talked about pressures, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Right here, they show us the pressures in the ventricles. So there's the ventricle. Sorry, guys, we gotta step back and too close to it. Yes, there's the pressure in the aorta, not the ventricle, I'm sorry. But it kind of gives you a feel. So here's the pressure in the ventricle. You see it's going to start pretty low and it's going to go up, and that's all during that time when it's squeezing but the doors aren't open, right? Please come back. What happened? Do I have to sign in? I do indeed. Sorry guys, I don't know what happened. We are experiencing technical difficulties. What do you mean it was wrong? It was right a minute ago, it's gotta be right. I know you asking you guys have seen HAL 9000, 2001 Space Odyssey. You don't all know best stories and they're lost on you guys. You're just too young. Anyway, so right here is when the valve opens, because it's right there that the pressure of the aorta, the red line, goes above the pressure in the pressure in the ventricle goes above the pressure of the aorta, which makes sense. As long as he is weaker than the pressure in the aorta, that valve is not going to move. But as soon as he goes 1 millimeter above what it is in the aorta, it opens up. And the pressure that he generates is going to go all the way up to a peak, which is the 120 that we talked about, right? So there's the low pressure of in the aorta, the 80. And he's going to push that, and as he pushes, he's going to actually push the pressure in the aorta up too. But eventually, he's got to relax. About the time that this guy, somewhere about, I don't know, just before the T wave, this guy's going to hit his maximum pressure. But the T wave, the ventricle is relaxing, the pressure is dropping. The pressure hasn't dropped back down way low, but it starts. And that brings us to the next thing. Isovolumetric relaxation. Okay. once the pressure in the ventricle drops below the pressure in the aorta, then the aorta is going to slam shut the aortic valve. Make sense? Okay, the aortic valve is shut. Or let's just say both of them are. All the SL valves are shut. The AV valves are still shut too, right? Because they stay shut where the ventricle's contracted. All 4 valves are closed. Isn't that what we said on contraction? Well, what's the difference? It's relaxing, it's not squeezing. So there's twice during the heart cycle when all the 4 valves are going to be closed. Once is when it's squeezing and trying to build up pressure. Once is when it's relaxing, but it still has more pressure than there is in the atrium. Now, this is the atrial pressure right here, guys. This is the pressure inside the atrium. So most of the time it's way lower than that in the ventricle. But eventually the ventricular pressure is going to drop down below the atrium, and when that happens, the AV valves open and blood starts pouring back into the heart, and we start the whole shebang over again. Kind of makes sense? So we've talked about the pressures, we've talked about the valves, we've talked about, we haven't talked about the volume. This is the last thing, actually. The volume, really don't want to go too deep into this because we're going to talk about this on Thursday because I don't want to overload you. I feel like I've already dropped a whole bunch on you. And in systolic and in diastolic volumes are involved. But we gotta complete the cardiac cycle. All this is saying is how much blood is there in the ventricle, right? So at the start, it's got a little bit, and then all through there, well, that's the part that actually is filled just when the valve is open and just falling straight through, right? That's the 80% that just falls straight through. Now, right here is the P wave, so that means the atrium is starting to contract, and that's the extra 20% being pushed into the ventricle right there. You see it goes from, I don't know, let's call that 115, goes from about 115 to 130. In other words, I get another 15 milliliters in because these guys squeeze. Okay, now there's isovolumetric contraction. Well, the volume doesn't change at all during that, right? Because all the valves are closed. The thing is squeezing, but he hasn't moved any blood. If you hadn't moved any blood, then the blood is still there, right? Now, we've got the valve opening up, the aortic valve, and when the aortic valve opens up, then the blood starts flowing out. And if it flows out, then that means I have less. Sure, this makes sense. And then I go to the very bottom, and then I start, that's that passive filling, that 80% that note is just falling in there, and there it goes again. That's the atrial kick, that's the extra 20%.
Exactly.
That
part made the most sense.
That is cardiac physiology in a nutshell. This is what you need to understand. There are a lot of good, we got a little bit of time. Let me put one on, because I really don't want to go too much further.